Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 181, Leicester's Men, a conversation with Laurie Johnson. For today's guest episode, it's a pleasure to welcome Laurie Johnson to the podcast. Laurie's book, Leicester's Men and Their Plays, is a fascinating study of one of the most influential of the playing troupes of the Elizabethan period, and the story of how they lived and functioned under one of the most powerful nobles in the land. As you will hear, Laurie's research to try to draw an ever better picture of the players and playing in the period is ongoing, and leading to some interesting postulations. Laurie Johnson is Professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Southern Queensland, and is a Fellow of both the Society of Antiquaries in London and the Royal Historical Society. His current roles include President of the Marlowe Society of America, Research Dramaturg for the Oxford Marlowe Project, Academic Advisor for the Museum of Shakespeare in Shoreditch, and Project Researcher for the Weather Extremes in England's Little Ice Age 1500 to 1700 database. His publications include The Earl of Leicester's Men and Their Plays and Shakespeare's Lost Playhouse, 11 Days in Newington Butts. As you will be able to hear, I had a bit of a microphone issue during our recording thanks to a dodgy cable that has now been replaced. I have improved my sound as much as possible on the recording, but my questions still sound a bit distant, so with apologies I hope you can bear with it. Fortunately, everything was good at Laurie's end, and his answers are, in every sense, crystal clear. I spoke to Laurie over Zoom while he was in the UK, in York in fact, at the end of a research trip. Although much of your work has been focused on Leicester's men, who do hold quite a special place in the development of the acting troupes, there were for some time just one of several playing troupes that we know about. So can you give us a sense of what we know about the troupes, let's say in the early years of Elizabeth's reign?
Thanks, Phil. The issue, of course, is that we know of a lot of companies, but most of the companies that theatre historians have long known about have focused on the later years of Elizabeth's reign. So when we talk about the Elizabethan theatre, we're focusing on companies, Strang's men, Derby's men, then Lord Chamberlain's men, and so on, Lord Admiral's. Leicester's Men Company to me was pretty special because so much of what we know about early theatre in the early part of Elizabeth's reign really comes back to that company as the most prolific, dominant, powerful, in a sense, company insofar as their patron, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was pretty much Elizabeth's right-hand man for quite some time, and many people have written about their potential relationship and the prospects that he may have had for marrying her at some stage. But there are many other companies, as you rightly say. The great work on that was originally done by a fellow named John Tucker Murray just over a century ago, who published a collection by wandering around various towns and doing the kind of work that's now done by the Records of Early English Drama Project, READ, where they're going through the archives as they can in various locations around England and in London to identify evidence of playing company activity. What Murray did was initially just to find as much evidence as he could in a very short space of time about a range of playing companies, and it became very quickly apparent that there were many companies in circulation at that time, but most of them were short-lived. They would be what I would call occasional companies. A powerful lord or patron or baron would decide that he wanted to put on a show for people and would need to hire a company, some players for an entertainment or an interlude of some kind, and they would be called the Earl of such and such's players, and so they pop up in the record and are paid as such. But in terms of longevity and a actual touring itinerary, Leicester's, I think, is the first to really put their stamp on what we now identify as the touring companies of the Elizabethan period. There are a few that predate that, but I'm happy to talk about that, I think, in sort of subsequent discussion as we expand out. In fact, Robert Dudley's own father, John, had at least one playing company of his own as well for quite a few years.
This is getting back into you're talking about the latter years of Henry VIII's reign, or even before that, because those are really quite murky areas for us theatre buffs, aren't they?
That's right. Henry VIII, the first Edwardian period, and in the Marian period, Mary's reign, Mary herself had a playing company, and she also authorised two other companies to tour and perform. The question is, what were they touring for? Why were they touring? This is where we've long thought that it was around travelling first, that they were sort of itinerant players who then settle in London and take up with a patron, and that this becomes more important after 1572. The Vagabond Act, as it's known, gets put through by Elizabeth and her Privy Council, and it effectively says that anybody who's wandering the countryside, if they do not have the license of a patron, will be deemed to have been a vagrant or vagabond, and therefore treated as such by any place they visit. But my sense is that when you dig further and further back through the records, you find that that's a very specific articulation of what had been a long-standing practice of patronising companies of players that goes back to the Henrician reign, back to Henry VIII, absolutely.
That's interesting that records of touring companies or any performances during Mary's reign, do we have many details about what they were performing?
Not so much what they were performing, but we just know that they exist because where they visited, they were, of course, paid handsomely by the town out of the town treasury. It was expected and had been for some time that if a noble patron's company visited a town, they would be paid a standard rate, a fixed rate that's accorded to their status. By the time we get to Elizabeth, for example, it's 40 shillings for a town for the Queen's men. It's 20 shillings for a senior noble like the Earl of Leicester, and it's usually 10 shillings for a lesser noble or baron's company. However, some towns are not rich enough to be able to afford that out of their coffers, and so there'll be a variable rate attached. So you get some very small locations that might only pay 12 shillings for a royal company, and then it would be 6 shillings. So it's the same rate.
Okay.
Half and half again tends to be what applies when you go through.
Yeah, I'm guessing that doesn't necessarily reflect on the quality of the acting, just the status of the nobleman who is sponsoring the troupe.
I think that's absolutely right. However, there is a moment in the history of the Queen's men where their rate of pay starts to drop, and I think that might go to do with the quality of the company. Mm-hmm. The Queen herself sort of allows people to start paying less for them because they get overtaken by Leicester's men and a couple of other troops, and eventually Lord Chamberlain's men as premier companies.
Yeah, the whole movement of players between companies and how they, at one point, some of them completely implode and join up again seems to be very complicated, and I think we don't have the whole picture of it, but we might talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But how about the travelling player? Let's just go back to that Elizabethan travelling player. Do we have a good sense of where they were going? And I assume they were kind of following a trail as we might do as a tourist around England these days. They were going to particular places because they knew they were good for a performance or several.
Now, I think the knowing what's good for a performance comes secondary. Mm-hmm. What I think starts is that the players are initially sent to locations that are particularly important to their patron. So one of the first people I read that talked about this prospect, although we now think that it's usually remembered that Sally Beth Maclean and Scott Macmillan write about this in relation to the Queen's men effectively working as propaganda agents for Protestant theology and plays of that ilk. But I think what we find is Bill Ingram, for example, wrote about John Dudley. So I mentioned John Dudley a moment ago. Bill Ingram writes in this wonderful little essay from about 20, 30 years ago that John Dudley's players go to places which you can identify with Dudley's own political and financial or property interests, and that suggests that they are standard bearers for the patron when they go to specific places. which means, of course, not that they get initial say in where they're going, but what I think then develops as you get a more active touring itinerary for a company like Leicester's Men is that they know where they have to get to, but they start adding other places on the way. And so that tweaks their circuit as they find better places to perform that pay out better, for example, or where they're more welcome. Some locations will say, we don't want the players. Others will say, yes, please come in.
Yes, and I guess for some places that was quite a hard stop if councils didn't approve of playing generally.
Yeah, that's right. But I must say, one of the things I did learn when I was digging into Leicester's Men in particular is that their itinerary changed, or their circuit, their route changed. The conventional thinking has for some time been that the circuits that other companies later were following were the same circuits that Leicester's Men were following because they were already the old trade routes.
Right.
However, the evidence that I'm finding about the trade routes is that they're different. However, when you look at the Leicester's Men's earliest touring in 1559 to 60 and 1560 to 61, the first years of Elizabeth's reign, and the first year that Leicester is allowed to send them out as his own company. Because, of course, prior to that, he was in disgrace. He'd been attainted, and so he had to be restored before he was allowed to have a company that could be at least called Lord Dudley's company at the time. He didn't get the Earl until 5 years later. But as Lord Dudley's company, they show up in routes that don't match what we later see as their touring circuits. They do match old trade routes that are mapped in what are called itineraries, books of itineraries, how to get from London to York, for example, following a specific set of towns, and they just happen to be the same ones that Leicester's Men are popping up in. But what happens in the mid-1560s is that during one such tour, a significant flood hits the Lincolnshire area. Must be through tidal surges and so on. We know of a fair amount of climate volatility at that time now. A lot of research is sort of going into how the Little Ice Age, as it's called, affected the climate of the British Isles. And this is a particularly volatile decade. So Leicester's Men are initially going to Norwich, and from their previous circuits, we know they then work back across to Nottingham or one of the other Midlands towns and then head back up to York and going via Lincolnshire. But in the middle of the 1560s, they can't do that because it's suddenly inaccessible due to rising floodwaters. So they have to circle back round, get back to London, and then take off again, going directly up through the old Roman road towards York. And they then repeat that again in 2 years later, and then again the year after that. And that suddenly locks in what we now know as the East Anglian Circuit, which later companies followed. Not many companies at all would continue through Lincolnshire after Leicester's Men stopped doing so. So yes, they followed circuits, and yes, there was old trade routes, but there's this little gap where that company has to experiment and innovate with trying out different circuits as a result of mitigating circumstances.
Fascinating. So something like weather conditions can absolutely be seen to have an effect on how they planned their routes. Because at the end of the day, they're going to get to wherever they can get to so they can perform and earn some money, presumably.
Absolutely, yeah. And not just to earn money, but also to fulfill their brief for their patrons.
Absolutely.
Who would have wanted them performing in the north, for example, in this case.
Which might be a good point to ask you a question that I always like to ask people like yourself is, what sort of records are you looking at to glean this information? Because it's not coming from where someone's written this all out in a detailed book or diary somewhere. Those things just don't really exist for theatre history.
Yeah, now, so initially with the touring itineraries, a lot of it does exist, but you have to glean it from, this is where the records of early English drama are so useful. These are editorial compilers who have researchers going into the towns in a specific region. So there'll be a read volume for York, a read volume for Cheshire, a read volume for Coventry, et cetera, et cetera. And so you just go through there and find when the company would have been there, and you start to plot the routes that way. But, of course, the read volumes are still being written. So a lot of material also has to be backfilled from other research. So a lot of it does mean actually doing some additional original archival research. Or there can be records that have been written about variously by people who've done some research on something completely tangential, but you find that there's a really useful reference to something that's been missed so far by Reed simply because they haven't dug in that area yet. One of the great ones that I found, that it's a letter. It's not even a record of payment to a company. There is a letter in 1560, in York, where it shows up. Someone researching in the north, Bob Anderson, I think his name was from memory, publishes that he'd found this letter among other documents of regulation of drama and other activities in the north. And it's a letter written to the Mayor of York from the Privy Council about the plague of that year, saying that a number of provisions that they need to put in place to prevent the spread of plague in the north, one of which, of course, would be shutting down the activities of merchants or some of the sailors that are going up that way. But there's a special passage in there where they refer explicitly to a date range in which you will expect a visit from the Earl of Leicester's men, or in this case, Lord Dudley's men, and that they are to be paid not to perform in the town, but to be allowed to stay if needed and then quit after 3 days. So they must move on within 3 days. Now, of course, the only reason the Privy Council would know of the Earl of Leicester's men going to York is if the patron himself knew their movements. He was a member of the Privy Council, Lord Dudley. And so this helped me square an argument that a lot of people have long thought, that the patrons really had no interest in what their players were doing, that it was just a folly that they took these players and then said, now go and wear our livery around the town, but don't you disgrace us. However, this particular letter tells us, no, the Privy Council knew exactly where they were going and when they were expected to be there and to give instructions. And the hope was that this letter would reach the town before the players did. As it turns out, it missed them by a couple of days, so it arrived a little bit after. But this to me tells us a lot about the playing companies and where they went and how we know where they went. So there's a lot more to be found in private correspondences of nobles who had playing companies, I think, that's still out there waiting to be found, and little gems like that will show up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A little nugget there. That's fascinating. And I suppose we shouldn't be so surprised. The level of control that the Privy Council seem to want to
absolutely
make over pretty much, well, not every walk of life, but many areas in life. It's quite astounding, isn't it? I wanted to come on to one of the main points in your book, which is that although the conventional view about Leicester's men in particular is that they were one of the travelling troops who then made a decision to base themselves more permanently in London, but you're suggesting that actually the opposite might be the case. And I just want you to take us through that, because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things, this is again Bill Ingram, who's kind of the inspiration for this kind of work, is that in a book that he published nearly 30 years ago called The Business of Playing, where he identifies a number of players that we associate with the major companies and locates them in parish records, identifies where they lived, where they married, where they died as well, where they were buried. And he manages to trace a significant presence of players that we would normally call touring companies in London. But he doesn't go far enough back into the early 1550s, mid and to late 1550s. So he doesn't have an interest in Leicester's men in that respect. But I did the same thing by going to the parish records, and it gets a little tricky with the 1550s because, of course, a lot of the records of parishes prior to about the 1560s are significantly lost, even though they'd been mandated from 1538 onwards. A lot of those early books are just gone. But Ancestry.com, there are other databases around, but Ancestry.com have basically access to any parish record that's been digitized over the last 20 years and becomes a remarkably effective tool for locating people. The search engine is not great because it's not properly tagged by experts in the field. And so a lot of the names are misrepresented from people who aren't reading early hand. But at the very least, if you kind of know where you need to be looking to start with, going through those records page by page and being able to read early hand, you start to find those people. and I was able to find several of the key figures that we know were members of the Earl of Leicester's men, because they're named in the license of 1572, that they're there in London in the 1550s with property, paying their tithes, marrying, having children, burying family members in the same parishes. And in fact, for the Earl of Leicester's men,
right,
all bar one of them, it's in St. Stephen, Coleman Street, where they're located in the St. Stephen's Church, which tells me that they were established in that location first, before they gained a noble patron, and then before they go out touring on routes that serve his needs in the first instance.
And I mean, well, first off, I had no idea you could use Ancestry to get that far back into records. That's quite a thing. How does that fact change our view of what was going on there?
I think it just means we need to be prepared to imagine that there's not a sudden shift from the wandering amateur minstrel / travelling player to London-based companies. The conventional argument is that once the Queen, Elizabeth, decides she wants a lot of company performing at court for her Christmas revels, then they have to settle down in London because then they're going to be close to her, that it's a little the other way around, that they're in London, they're guilds people, they work for the guilds, they're joiners and grocers and so on. But they're also dabbling in performance arts at that time and forming little guild companies, from where we then get the patrons who decide they need to impress the Queen. Let's find the best of their kind. And it just so happens that James Burbage's crew were at that time the best of their kind. So Dudley says, you guys will do for me. But he then also says, well, my dad, John, had a company troupe going around to a few key locations, being a standard bearer for his particular message. And in particular, that was to do with who should be the rightful next heir of the throne. And Robert Dudley decides to replicate that method by saying, go out and go to Norwich in the first instance, because I would like to be member for Parliament for Norwich in 1559. And sure enough, he gets to be member for Parliament. And I think a part of that is not the key factor, but a part of that would be having the players go out and win the hearts and minds of the people in that area.
So London was an attraction just because of the population density there?
Absolutely. Yeah, we know Burbage was born in Bromley in Kent, but from there it's not a long hop for him to have moved up to London, and we know
even then it wasn't a long hop.
That's right. And we know in the 1550s he takes up an apprenticeship as a joiner, and that's where he kind of sets up initially in London, but then he starts popping up as a member of a playing company, as a lead member. Yeah.
And just to pick up on the point you touched on there, is that Elizabeth obviously gathers the best of the best together. I've heard you describe them as a players' supergroup. So is it just her vanity project, or was there more to it than that?
Yeah, and so this comes in 1583 when the Lord Treasurer is kind of given the task of forming this group that will represent the Queen. Now, there had been Queen's Men companies before this, but they were a little more piecemeal in their operation. They probably came from members of the household or from other companies that followed their own course, a more organic approach to their formation, whereas the Queen's Men, the treasurer goes out, or at least sends out his agents to identify the best of the best and form this particular group. And in a sense, they do occupy that status of what we would now call a supergroup. They are the lead performers of the various major companies. Richard Tarleton, for example, and they're all brought together. As to why she does it, there are a number of different theories as to whether it's a vanity project or whether it's a political project, that because they know that touring companies can win the hearts and minds of people, send them off on the road and get them performing the Queen's message to the people without the Queen herself having to progress everywhere. We know she liked to progress, but it's a more slow process. And so the Queen's Men go off doing that. They're also well rewarded, and when they do perform at court, they're very well rewarded. But I don't think there can be a single consensus. I don't think without that smoking gun document, for example, that might be the letter of her orders to Cecil or Burleigh or whoever, that there must be something out there that would give a clearer sense of the rationale. However, just by virtue of the fact that they're off on the road so soon after they're formed, tells us they were formed to tour rather than they were formed primarily for her entertainment. I think that's a good guide there for a start, that they were about the message that they were conveying rather than simply being her getting to see the best of the best.
Because a lot of her entertainments was focused very much around the Christmas period.
Absolutely.
And if I'm right, I think that became very extended during James I's reign, where you have this almost 3 months, I think, of Christmas-related celebrations.
Even during Elizabeth's time, yeah, we do get periods during Elizabeth's time where I think the Master of Revels under the Lord Chamberlain's guidance or oversight does get charged with putting on far more lavish and drawn out productions or sort of calendars of production. So you do get things starting in mid-December and not finishing until early February. But yeah, certainly under James. And that's more, I think, to do with Anne of Denmark. I think when Queen Anne really gets into the theatre, she gets her own company, but they also get really extended revels, yeah.
Yeah, she liked a bit of performing as well, didn't she?
Absolutely.
She turned up in Johnson's Masks and
that's right.
That kind of thing. Yeah. So what happened out in the touring area during that period? They were still going out, even though they were spending more time in London?
Yes. So the records are actually fairly inconsistent on this. There's no specific rhyme or reason as to why they're going when they go. The question of when they go. There was this long-standing thought that, well, it makes sense that they would tour in summer and stay in London during winter. And that's, of course, when the revels would be on. But there's a lot of evidence of touring all year round as well. When some companies go off on long tours, they are long tours and they can last 6 months or more and drag well into the winter period. So there's nothing specifically consistent about it. And I think it's to do with the volatility of the climate at that time, that there are some winters, even though it's called a little ice age. Trust me, the famous frost fairs that we associate with London, they don't start until 1607. So a lot of touring is happening in the previous 50 years during far more mild winters and more volatile summers. The summer becomes a slightly more dangerous time to tour when it gets excessively hot or when it gets terribly wet, when you get these flooding episodes.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard life, isn't it? You have to imagine they're dragging a cart or two full of all their gear on foot, maybe with some help. But, you know, that's a real commitment to your art to travel around the country like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to walk, and there are days when I can do 20,000 steps, and I will just amaze myself at the sort of standard distance that a company would travel from one day to another. We tend to think 15 to 20 miles is the distance they would travel on a daily grind to get from one location to the next location. Most of the locations they visit, and we know when they're there, that's 15 to 20 is about the standard. If there's 2 days between visits, their towns are 30 to 40 miles apart. And that's a lot more than 20,000 steps. And I usually feel absolutely spent after a day like that.
Yes.
They're then still having to perform and get stuff and do all of these things. That they must have been remarkably fit people.
Yeah. Yeah, I've just got this image of them in a muddy track dragging a heavy cart. That's hard work.
But of course, people often wonder what would be the attraction. The records that we have of payments from towns are not enough to sustain that kind of lifestyle and make any kind of profit out of it. So there must have been other ways of making money. For a start, we know they must have been performing more than once in each location and takings at a door or at a pub. But also, I think there's a lot of lost records of them performing at major estates where they would have been paid more handsomely, almost the same kind of rate that you would expect the Queen to be paying for a company performing at court, which is upwards of several pounds rather than only 40 shillings. So I think that's part of the attraction. I think it's performing at those major estates or for rich families that is something that's relatively lost from the record, except in those little moments when we see them pop up in the Thomas North household payments, for example. That we get these little family records where they do pay handsomely for playing companies, which suggests that there's far more widespread of that practice. There's a number of things that I think Leicester's men, there's enough evidence, however one compiles it and makes the argument, that they do institute a number of the practices that we later associate with playing, but we tend to back project it as if it was always the way that Leicester's men were a group of sharers or did have a repertory or had apprentices. I think each of those practices, you can identify a moment when it happens, and it happens for a specific reason. So the boy players, initially they start just hiring boy players when they need to expand the company size, but without bringing in permanent talent. So they've got a play that requires 14 players, for example, and they've only got a standard size of 6 at the moment, so they get in a bunch of hired performers. But when that goes pear-shaped, Burbage being Burbage, he actually decides to start refusing to pay people what they're owed for their hired services, and you get a few law cases. And at a given moment, I think the company says, first of all, we're going to cut you loose, Burbage. You're a liability. But secondly, we can't go around relying on hiring people willy-nilly. We need to actually start where guilds people. We know what apprenticeship involves. We should start using the same process ourselves as part of our company business. And you can identify when that happens. And that's sort of the early 1580s. Takes a while for them to get there, but that's when the evidence starts showing up that Richard Tarleton takes on an apprentice, Will Kemp takes on an apprentice. Right. Yeah.
So they mirror the guild.
Absolutely.
There wasn't a guild at the time for actors, obviously, or for players.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And that's, just to be clear with everybody, that's James Burbage we're talking about.
That one, yes. So Richard Burbage's son doesn't come onto the picture until a decade later. Yeah.
After is a terribly volatile character when you, even from what I've read, I can see.
Absolutely. And Richard admittedly takes up after his father in a number of ways, and can be a bit of a difficult character, but I think he's at least smart enough to not burn his bridges as so that's actually a bit of a pun because the Burbage name appears in some of the records as Bridges. But I think Richard at least is a bit more savvy in the respect of in being respectful to some extent. Of course, a bit of bravado is part of his character, but nevertheless, clearly he and Shakespeare developed this working relationship for some time. Yeah. James never really developed that relationship with any of his partners in crime or in playing or with particular playwrights.
My thanks to Laurie for taking time out of his busy schedule to talk to me. And I'm pleased to say that we will be hearing more about James Burbage and the apprenticeship of players in the next guest episode. But while I had Laurie on, I just couldn't resist also asking him about his work as part of the Oxford Marlowe project.
I know you're involved in a big Marlowe project at the minute. Perhaps you could tell us something about that.
Yeah, so it's called the Oxford Marlowe project. It's being run by a number of folks, but particularly Rory Loughnane and Catherine Richardson, initially out of University of Kent. But the project involves not just a Marlowe collected works to be published by Oxford, but a range of online resources and complementary materials and so on. And I've been brought on board to work on Marlowe's plays on the road, on tour, so to speak, identifying which companies had Marlowe plays, when they had them, where they would have been performing them. So one of the ones I'm most enamoured in working on at the moment, and I did some work on this just yesterday with some folks in the York Guildhall, trialling out a scene from Tamburlaine Part 2, which shows up in Lord Admiral's Men's Possession at around the time they would have been touring their first major tour as a company in 1589, which speaks to the prospect that Tamburlaine Part 2 could have been performed in York. Having performed it with some folks in that space, I'm prepared to go on the record and say it feels like Marlowe wrote that for provincial performance, that it's not a London play as such. It's a play for Guildhall performance for a company that's about to go on the road. It sort of breaks what we think we know about Marlowe as a London-based playwright as well. I think there's an evolution of Marlowe as a playwright for London stages, but that he's writing initially, I think, for touring companies at around a moment when touring is big in that late 1580s.
So can you go into a little about what it is about that sets it up for touring?
So the play itself, people talk about the spectacle. There's a lot of big props needed, which would suggest that it really has to be performed at a place where you have a tiring house and props and so on. But some of the bigger guild halls certainly have the space. And in York in particular, there are records of the local playing. The York mystery plays are absolutely a long-standing tradition which require a significant number of large props and great costumes and so on. But a number of the scenes in that play in particular require specific props that show up in York at the time as being already a little bit old. So there's a prospect that they would be saying, we have this company and we have these props. And at some point, those two things need to align or would have aligned where the players would have been armed with a play that could work so long as they're in that location that has those props available. Now, that, of course, people would say that's a long way to get to York before you can finally perform that play. I also have a counter argument that I've been running for a little while now, that Marlowe also writes in such a way that the mighty line that we call Marlowe's kind of bombastic delivery, Chamberlain speaks for these grandiose speeches. He doesn't necessarily have to always be referring to an object that's specifically and obviously visible on stage. People can be asked to use their imaginations. And I think that's happening a fair bit. If you're in a smaller space, you can say, see that dragon up there? You don't actually need a dragon as such hanging from the ceiling. It can be enough to point in a direction and the people will go, oh, there's a dragon nearby. So I think there's a bit of work going on in early Marlowe that's about creating a space for imagination, but also for places that can provide the kinds of props or spaces that he needs. There's a lot of spatial, physical, building-oriented language in these plays. This pillar here, that table there, that can speak to a specific location, no matter where you are, so long as you're in a building that has a pillar and a building that has a table.
And you're hoping to find more Marlowe productions in the records for the project?
Well, we know of a couple already. There's an anecdote of Marlowe being performed, Faustus being performed on a provincial stage, I think it's in Essex from memory. Exeter from memory. And the anecdote goes that during a performance of Faustus, the assembly, the crowd start to become mindful that there's one too many devils on stage. And they freak out and start running and screaming, and some souls are lost apparently in this tumult. So we do know some. I think the rest is about piecing together plays with companies at the time that they are at a location to say it's more likely that they'd be performing something relatively new if they've got it. If they've got a play and then they're about to go on the road, they're probably going to want to show off their new work. So it's then about at least piecing together, would this be a play that would work in those locations that we then see that company on the road? And that's the sort of job of reconstruction that I'm going to be working on over the next year or two, little by little.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Because to fill any gaps in the Marlowe story would be quite significant, I think, wouldn't it? Just to help us all understand exactly who and what he was.
Well, at the very least, as a playwright, that's what I can bring to the story. Others would be more equipped to work on the biographical material. But if I can find any good evidence of Marlowe himself being involved in some of these productions, absolutely, I'm going to be shouting them from the rooftops, yes.
Well, I'm sure that is a project that is well worth keeping an eye on for future developments. Laurie's book, Leicester's Men and Their Plays, is published by Cambridge University Press, and I've put a couple of links to that in the show notes, and also a link to the Oxford Marlowe project. Next time, it's back to the plays, and for many, Shakespeare's finest history play, Henry V, as Shakespeare invites us to leave the wooden O for the fields of France, where a young king proves that he has grown up fast. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I've put links to both of those sites in the show notes. I look forward to accompanying next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can always contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.